To begin the discussion of the Great Jamaican Slave Revolt, we have to start with how the African men, women, and children ended up in this horrific situation. From the earliest societies and kingdoms to the Roman Empire and the 19th century, slavery has existed, and as a natural result, slave trading has taken place, whether it's buying, selling, or bartering of a human life. In the early days of slavery, people, no matter their race, color, religion, or social class, were subjected to be sold into slavery. The selling of a human's life was no different than selling any other object of value. Prior to the 19th century, slave trading was based off opportunity rather than morality. The traditional form of slavery was changed by the Europeans. They treated the enslaved individual as a piece of property who belonged to his or her owner and had no rights. The individual is enslaved for life, and his or her children are born enslaved as well. These chattel slaves were treated like cattle, from which the word chattel comes from, were bought and sold just like animals. With the emergence of trading opportunities in the Americas and the ease of the winds and the ocean currents in the Atlantic Ocean, it made this a feasible and profitable route for traders. The transatlantic slave trade began around 1501 and it ended in 1867. This route, which included just about every country with an Atlantic coastline, helped remove about 12.5 million African people from their native lands. Human cargo was used to work as domestic labor in workshops and also as field hands, especially on the sugarcane plantations. The cultivation of sugarcane began in the Pacific before Christ. Over 2 millennia, it went westward around the globe and re entered the Pacific from the Americas in the 19th century. Once Portuguese and Spanish voyages of discovery had initiated conquest around the Atlantic basin, sugar became the economic foundation of the transatlantic trade. The growth of the sugarcane plantations created for export production grew from the eastern Atlantic to the Gulf of Guinea and then to northeastern Brazil. It emerged in the far east of the Caribbean and Barbados and spread from there to the remainder of the Caribbean. In 1812, James Stephen Sr., a member of the British Parliament and director of the African Institute, which was an anti-slavery group, came with the idea that each of the British colonies should create and maintain a registry of its enslaved individuals. The plantain owners were responsible for recording their age, gender, stature, birthmarks, and country of origin. Also, for the first time, birth and death records were to be kept. Trinidad was the first colony requested to complete the registration process in March of the same year. When the census was taken a year later, the number of enslaved had increased by 4,500. The abolitionists provided this as proof as an underground slave trade happening in the colonies, which the planters had previously denied. By 1815, each of the colonies and the West Indies were required by law to participate in the census of the enslaved. The plantation owners were angry because they felt this was a ploy to end slavery and they felt it was a taxation without representation since they did not have representation in the British Parliament and were made to pay the expense of the registration. They also complained that their autonomy was being violated and they were being told how to handle their private property, their enslaved. A year following the census, the enslaved in Barbados revolted. The plantation owners blamed it on the census. A leader in the British Parliament, an anti-slave trader, William Wilberforce, said the slaves rebelled because the plantation owners misrepresented the objective of the abolitionist campaign. He felt that the planters talked about the registration matter in front of their human cargo. When they did that, they represented and repeated untruths like the abolitionists were going to free the slaves and the census counts were a tool that's going to be used to free them. The registration did not include freedom to the enslaved. In 1816, legislator Henry Brougham showed the Assembly 3 newspaper articles that claimed the registration was a cover for emancipation. He warned the colonists that slave revolts would occur more regularly if these mistruths continued. By the 1820s, more than 2,500 enslaved men and women were escaping from plantations every year, and there had been multiple slave rebellions. In Jamaica in 1831, an educated enslaved preacher by the name of Samuel Sharp had led the largest slave revolt in the colony's history. Sharp gained the trust of the enslaved because of his work as a minister around the island, of course, with his master's permission. What he did was he convinced the enslaved men and women to peacefully stop working in order to force the captors' hand so they could get paid for their work in the sugarcane fields. Their peaceful protest quickly escalated, and the enslaved began to burn down the homes of their masters and the warehouses that held the sugarcane. Over 200 plantations were destroyed, and 20,000 slaves seized the large portions of the island. The major part of the rebellion lasted 10 days, but it took the British military until January of 1832 to restore full order. About 200 enslaved men and women, 14 planters, and overseers were killed. Hundreds of the rebellious slaves were captured, and over 750 were convicted. 138 were sentenced to death by hanging or firing squad. Those that were not sentenced to death were severely punished. Samuel Sharp was hanged in a public execution. When all was said and done, over £1 million of property and commodities were destroyed. This revolt was key in helping the British end slavery because it instilled fear in the British government and the planters. They were afraid widespread war would break out. 1 week after the death of Sharp, the British Parliament selected a committee to review ways on how to end slavery.